Good morning, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Confidential Advocacy Program, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar series. My name is Jackson Brown. My pronouns are they, them, their, and I am one of the confidential advocates with the Confidential Advocacy Program, otherwise known as CAP. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Annie Forsman-Adams with WomenSpirit Coalition, who is presenting on supporting Indigenous survivors and considerations and best practices when working with survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. Annie uses she and her and they, them pronouns, and I myself, Jackson, use they, them pronouns. And we do not have any disclosures to share. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we live, work, and learn on in Portland, Oregon, and Multnomah County were the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Wasco, Molalla, Cowlitz, and Watlala bands of the Chinook and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. We acknowledge the history and genocide and forced removal from this territory and honor and respect the many Indigenous people still connected to this land. If you're not in Portland and watching this webinar, I encourage you to look up the native land you reside on and acknowledge the history, regardless of where you are, and do that work. And now I'm going to get into CAP and how you can access our services. And our hotlines or our support lines are staffed 24/7. And please feel free to reach out to us if you do need to speak to someone during the webinar. 833-495-CAPS is the number to reach our support lines. We do have a support line set up specifically in each campus location. And the reason we have these 5 different support lines for our OHSU-based campuses in the state of Oregon, the reason we set these up in those areas is so that after 5 p.m., when myself or Stacy are done working, the lines roll over to a local community-based agency where our agencies can support our OHSU students and employees who may need support. So in Portland, that's called a safety. And in Monmouth, that's Sable House. In La Grande, Shelter from the Storm. And in Ashland, Community Works. And in Klamath Falls, that's Marta's House. And please feel free to reach out to us throughout the webinar today if you need to. We're here for you all on our support lines, and our advocates are trained to connect you all with resources, validate your experiences, whatever those might look like. And Stacy regularly supports our staffs our support lines and is our primary confidential advocate with the team. And also presenting today is myself, Jackson. And you'll also, on our team also is our program director, Stephanie McClure. And you can reach any of us also through capsupport@ohsu.edu. And while we can't guarantee the same level of confidentiality that we can if you are to call us at 833-495-2277 or CAPS, we can still guarantee the confidential nature between the email communication with the 2 of us at the very least. Today, we also have 2 ASL interpreters and captions available. Thank you so much to EdCom and Language Services for making this possible and ensuring this is accessible. Each webinar is recorded and available for folks to watch for free. And please reference this area or this streaming platform if you would like to set up closed captioning. So yeah, just to get a little bit more into CAP, the Confidential Advocacy Program at OHSU. This is for survivors. We're really a program that's meant for survivors of gender-based violence and sexual misconduct at OHSU, who are students, employees, faculty, or even volunteers. Our mission is to center the voices of those who have experienced sexual misconduct and discrimination through education, advocacy, empowerment, connection, support, And we do all of this by imploring our values of social justice, intersectionality, inclusion and equity, self-determination, safety, and health. And we recognize that when we center the voices of those who are most vulnerable, we can improve supports for everyone. And then just to get a little bit more into opportunities to work with CAP, if you are a student, employee, or faculty member at OHSU looking for additional support, or if you're someone who would like to get involved in a broader community of survivors at OHSU, or look for ways to be an ally to those who may be survivors as well. We do have trauma-informed yoga and art therapy. You can sign up for art therapy in coordination with working with a confidential advocate like Stacy as you go through the art therapy sessions. Our Survivor Voices project is also something we're actively working on right now, as we invite all OHSU members who are survivors of harassment, discrimination, and violence in any form to join this project and collectively assist us. You can just give us a call, or even fill out our anonymous online form and let us know about some of the experiences yourself might have had, support that you wish you'd had, or support for those around you, or experiences of those around you that you might have otherwise might have known of and want to make things better for individuals. So if you have ideas on anything that would be helpful for survivors, just know we would love to hear from you at CAP, and that is the integral part of the Survivor Voices project in terms of making things better and advocating for our survivors at OHSU. We're also looking for members of our advisory council to better amplify the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, voices of people of color at OHSU, and as well as better amplify the voices of our LGBTQIA+ communities, people with disabilities at OHSU, and those who might identify as Two-Spirit or carry other identities at OHSU as well. We would love to find ways for this advisory council to basically keep us accountable in terms of the work that we're putting out there, and what ourselves as CAP employees and volunteers with our program can do with our energy and our time as we move forward. Neither the Survivor Voices Project or the Advisory Council are work groups. These are not work groups. These are efforts where individuals can find community, can gather to help us better see how to get resources to folks who need them the most, and really just help us ensure that we're being held accountable to appropriately identify the action to center the voices of those most marginalized and most impacted by violence. And anyone who wants to volunteer with us at OHSU, please know that you can reach out to us as well. We offer the opportunity to go through a 40-hour training where you can become a confidential advocate and work within your team as well, and work with us more. And that's something our volunteers at OHSU do. We also have a Respect for All mobile app, which is a mobile application that individuals can use when they're questioning maybe their reporting responsibility, and a colleague of theirs has come to them and talked to them about sexual misconduct or discrimination or something that's happened, and has questions and is turning to you as a colleague and you don't know how to respond. Please use our mobile app or call us directly. But the reason we built the mobile app was so that folks had a way to navigate supports on their own time when they had that time available, and it'll also help pull up different resources for you as you continue to help someone. It can also help you if you're in that situation as well and want to look through different aspects of support. And I think you can also contact us, obviously, through our support line at any point, 833-495-2277, or CAPS, in all caps. And if you have questions for follow-up, please know You can email us at capsupport@ohsu.edu anytime during this presentation. And if there are questions that us as advocates can't answer, we'll of course work with Annie, and we run by all of our questions and answers for these sessions that are done in writing, but we run that by our presenters before responding. So yeah, I would love to move right into introducing our speaker today a little bit. Annie Forsman-Adams is the program director with WomenSpirit Coalition, or the Washington State Native American Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. The WomenSpirit Coalition is also the Indigenous Crime Victim Services Referral and Resource Center. And I will, as we get into supporting Indigenous survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault in clinical settings, we'll also discuss the importance of culturally responsive services, the importance of doing this work with individuals who are survivors of trauma in all settings. And I'm just really excited for y'all to hear more from Annie. And again, if you have any questions during today's webinar, please just follow up with us at capsupport@ohsu.edu, and we will make sure that everybody gets a list of questions, of all the questions that we received as well. As a reminder, just feel free to reach out to us on our hotline if you need anything at all. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Annie. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a great introduction. It was great to learn more about your program. So I'm super excited to be here today, and I appreciate all the work that went behind the scenes to get this webinar recording up. I know that everybody has been affected by 2020 in differing ways, so I'm really glad that we were able to all get together and work on this and get this presentation to fruition. So thank you all for that. If we could just go to the next slide, please. So as was stated, my name is Annie. I'm a Suquamish tribal member here in Washington State. I live and work on the ancestral territory of the Suquamish people in the Port Madison Reservation. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of our program. It's a little bit different as we work to provide kind of the holistic services to people in Washington State and the surrounding territories. So under the Washington State Native American Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, we kind of have two programs. We have WomenSpirit Coalition, which is what I'm here representing today. We do training, technical assistance, and other types of consultation and things like that specifically about domestic violence, sexual assault, and crime victimization among Indigenous populations. And to complement that, we have the Indigenous Crime Victim Services Referral and Resource Center. And this is a direct service arm of our program. And it's very new. We just founded this in 2017, and we were just funded to have it be a full-time program in 2019. So we're in our first year kind of in the full swing of things. And this is a great resource if you are experiencing crime victimization outside of domestic violence and sexual assault, although we absolutely do serve victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and survivors as well. So, but we service Indigenous folks in Washington State, across the state, and help identify resources for them outside of some of the tribal programs. And this organization, the organizational piece came about through work with our advocates who really noticed that there was a service gap between services for domestic violence and sexual assault survivors and survivors and victims of other types of crime. So we started this as a way to close that gap, but also to support advocates and support direct service professionals in the work that we're already doing, or they are already doing, excuse me. And so we really want to be able to support the professionals and the advocates that are doing that good work in a way that really helps them manage burnout, manage feelings of being overwhelmed, and also just in general needing and a helping hand in getting services to Indigenous crime victims. So we're super excited about this program, and it's been a challenge starting it in the late part of 2019 and with all of the things that are happening this year. But we are really, really encouraged by the response and really excited for that. So that is open. We take calls from everyone, and we are happy to find services. If you don't qualify for services through our organization, we are happy to collaborate and network with other service providers to make sure you get the services that you need. In fact, we just had a client in Portland who was kind of thinking about maybe relocating to Washington, maybe not, and ultimately stayed in Portland, and we were able to hook that client up with some great resources for Indigenous survivors in Portland. So we have lots of networks and lots of capacity to be able to get folks what they need when they need it. So we have two offices. We have our main office in Silverdale, Washington, which is the office that I am currently in and work out of most of the time, and that houses our Referral and Resource Center. And then we have the SQUIM office, which is located on Lower Elwha Clallam territory, and that is our administrative office. So that's where our executive director and some other supportive staff are, and then I work out of that office part-time. We could go ahead and do the next slide, please. So I just want to start with just a few disclaimers and a little bit of housekeeping and just kind of set the tone for how this presentation will go. I really encourage everyone to ask questions. This is a safe place for everybody to learn and everybody to grow. And this is a place where if you have ever been afraid to ask a question, I really encourage you to ask it here. I understand that education and knowledge is really a key to empowerment, and I want to make sure that I provide a place where people can openly ask questions about the things that they would like to know about Indigenous survivors. I think that that's really key. And I just want to say, I talk a lot, my expertise is in violence against Indigenous women. And so I talk a lot about best practices and things like that through that lens. And that I don't want ever that to be misconstrued. We are going to talk about gender and gender roles and people who identify as something other than women and cisgendered women. And we are going to talk about that. And I want to just really reiterate that this is a safe place for everybody. And Indigenous people have a really distinct way of looking at gender and a really distinct way of understanding gender roles. And that all kind of comes into part of why my work centers around what womanhood means and things like that. So please, like I said, just feel free to ask any questions that you have. I sometimes get really excited and talk really fast and get kind of caught in my thoughts. So if you ever need me to slow down or clarify something, please feel free to just interrupt me. It won't throw me off at all. And then finally, before we get started, some of the things that we're going to talk about today are difficult to hear. And some of this is going to be really new information for people. And we never know when we're dealing with trauma and vicarious trauma and traumatic responses, we never know when some bad feelings are going to come up. So I really just encourage you to take care of yourself and listen to your trauma signals, listen to your gut and your intuition about how you're feeling, and really make sure you're able to absorb this information in a way that's healthy for you, and that will lead to empowerment instead of any type of harm. So with those out of the way, if we could go to the next slide, please. So I just want to start a little bit about a brief history of the Coast Salish people. I think it's really important that we ground ourselves in the historical realities of the people and the Indigenous people that we live near. And so Coast Salish territory extends from Washington, Oregon, and into British Columbia. And we've lived here for the earliest history is about 10,000 years. And so we've inhabited this land for basically time immemorial. And we all identify, most tribes in this area identify as being Coast Salish, and that is a link between the way some of our cultural practices, the languages that we use, historic chiefs and leaders and things like that kind of link us all together as Coast Salish. And even when we look at Eastern Washington tribes, which some people will notice have kind of a Plains Indigenous culture, what's the word I'm looking for? Influence, there's the word, influence to them. We're still connected through language and lineage, through marriage and travel and things like that. So even those Eastern tribes, while they are culturally distinct, we are still connected to them in very important, very, very, and very historical ways. In Washington State, we have 29 recognized tribes with several more unrecognized. And I think one thing that's super important whenever you're working with Indigenous communities is that we remember that Indigenous communities are very distinct across cultural practices. And these practices can differ not just from tribe to tribe, but they can differ from village to village, from family to family. And so while what we're going to talk about today is a lot of kind of general blanket practices, it's always important to take your lead from whichever Indigenous community or Indigenous person you're working with. We're not all going to be a monolith. We're not all going to be the same. And in some cases, something that one community might do might be actually very offensive to another community. So there's always, I think that Indigenous people also know this reality. We don't expect everyone to know each diverse cultural practice from each community. And I think when intentions are good, that's always the best place to start. But we do want to just keep in mind that cultural practices are diverse. Next slide, please. So the Coast Salish culture and structure was pretty distinct among Indigenous populations, and we kind of are. We're interesting in the way that we were structured and the way that we our social and cultural boundaries were constructed. And so I think a lot of people have an understanding that there was kind of this blanket egalitarian society among Indigenous people, and that there were no structures of authority, and that there were no social roles or social hierarchy or anything like that. And while that is mostly accurate, it is important to understand that each community was different, and also the structures were looked at differently. So even though we didn't have a structure of authority that looked looks like in mainstream culture today, we did have a structure of authority that allowed people to make decisions in times of crisis or in times of war or things like that. And so there were also spiritual authority and other types of hierarchy that allowed people to look for guidance. But it was never the main difference was that it was a power to organize versus a power of organization. So what it was is that communities agreed on what was important and they organized around that, rather than the structure of authority determining what was important and forcing communities to organize around that one instance or event or goal or whatever it was. So we have a saying in our language that basically translates to everyone gets a say. And that was the very most distilled, simple way to express it was our governing structure, is that everyone got a say, and there were people who had to make a decision based on what everyone said, but it wasn't necessarily that everybody was going to be equally represented, but it was that everybody's point of view, from the oldest elder to the youngest child, was taken into account. And It's a little bit of a myth to claim that all Coast Salish societies were egalitarian, because we did have social class. So we did kind of have ways of determining who was high class or low class. What is really important is that those distinctions didn't come with any type of character association. So because you were of lower class, it didn't mean you were bad, and because you were of higher class, it didn't mean you were good. It was really a way of identifying what resources were available to the community. So we were very socially and politically complex. There was no one governing structure. There was no one social structure. It varied between villages. It varied between tribes. It varied between families. So one of the ways we showed our wealth and our status was through potlatch traditions and the gathering of people and the actual distribution of wealth. So we found it more advantageous as we were evolving and growing as communities to actually show our wealth by distributing it amongst our other less fortunate or less abundant members of our community. And we did that through feasts and through giveaways and things like that. And we continue many of these traditions today. So while you might get married in a more mainstream wedding ceremony, you will also never go to an Indigenous wedding where you leave empty-handed. It's a very very important cultural practice to us that no visitor ever leave empty-handed. And we always do things like provide food, and especially like my tribe, Suquamish, takes being a good host very, very seriously. So one of the things that's going to become important later on when we talk about kind of how we process through trauma with Indigenous survivors is the importance of storytelling. So storytelling was our way of providing context for situations, imparting important values, passing on our culture, and teaching people important lessons about life, about coming of age, about growing up, about how we interact with one another, and things like that. Another really important historical tie is our strong tradition of communal living. So even today, you'll find many generations living under the same roof. And even if they're not living under the same roof, you will find that you spend a lot of time with your parents and your grandparents and your aunts and your uncles. And we really count on the entire community as our way of survival, even today. And I think that this has become really important as we manage the ongoing pandemic, and as we manage the reality that has brought to communities, and we've really relied on those community ties as a way of survival. And when we were unable to gather, and when we were unable to do the things we normally do during summer months and things like that, we had to get really creative with how we keep those community ties together. And I think that Indigenous communities have once again shown a really amazing resiliency to adjusting to whatever kind of comes their way, and counting on the community as a way of survival. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about, this is a very kind of general understanding of Indigenous culture and personal relationships. And so I just want to talk about this a little bit, and again, just kind of root that in our historical understanding. I talked a little bit about gender roles, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about gender roles in some coming slides. But I think what's really important to remember is that gender and gender roles were not static or rigid in Indigenous communities. And there's very little pre-contact evidence that any tribe had static gender roles. There were roles, of course, and there were things based on just utility and function that certain genders did over other genders, of course, things like childbearing and things like that. But as we'll talk about later, they're very, very, very fluid, not rigid. And again, they didn't come with any character connotation to them. So whether you changed your gender or changed your gender role, it wasn't ever a statement of who you were as a person or your role in the community. And the views on violence against women, again, kind of vary a little bit, but from what we can understand is that violence against women was very, very frowned upon. It did happen, however, it did happen in some cases. And the main difference is that Indigenous justice systems were very victim-centered, very swift to justice, and very, very focused on balance and restoring balance and safety to a whole community. So violence against women and violence against what we would consider now gender nonconforming folks was very, very serious, and it was dealt with immediately. And it was always seen as a community safety problem rather than an individual victim or survivor problem. We also had different views on parenting. So we saw parents as guides for children, but children have a very special spiritual place in the world, especially very young children. So children were also a part of what we learned about our spiritual world. And so we never underestimated what children could teach parents as well as what parents could teach children. And so parenting just looked very, very different. And it was based on this idea of a symbiotic relationship between parent and child. And probably the most important part of this slide is that the idea that people could be viewed as property just really didn't exist. There's no evidence of it in our language. There's no evidence of that in our historical documents or historical practices or ceremonies or anything like that. Each person was autonomous, was sovereign, was able to make decisions about their own bodies and things like that. So one of the questions I've recently gotten about this specific point is that it is not uncommon, and it certainly is not a secret, that some tribal nations owned what we would, I guess, characterize as slaves. And it's really, really important when we talk about what that looked like in an Indigenous community compared to what it looked like with chattel slavery in early American history. The two are not in any way comparable. Usually, I always like to frame this as Indigenous communities cared the most about restoring some type of balance. And so if a member of an outlying tribe intended to do harm or did do harm to another Indigenous community, and they were captured for whatever reason, the emphasis was on restoring balance. So what did that person need to do to restore balance to that community that they had taken something from or harmed someone in? What's also really important to remember is that sometimes they opted to stay with whatever tribe they had tried to invade or whatever, because the act of being caught was very, very taboo and not seen. And so sometimes the tribe that they came from would actually say, no, go live with that tribe now. And often we would take on families and things like that. And we have we have lineages in our family that derive from these kinds of interactions and those kinds of things. So I think right now it's really popular to kind of punch down, I guess that's not a great term to use, excuse me. It's really popular to kind of degrade Indigenous communities as not being egalitarian and having this, and as somehow a way of saying, well, slavery has existed in all of these communities. And it's just really not a fair, it's just not a fair comparison. Okay, we could go to the next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about gender, sexuality, and Indian country and Indigenous cultures. I want to be super clear about something before I start this. I do not identify as a two-spirit person. I identify as cisgender and I identify as heterosexual. So I'm talking here from kind of what we know about the history, but I want to make it really clear that I am in no way an expert on two-spirit communities or anything like that. I've spent a lot of time learning from them and a lot of time with two-spirit individuals, and gotten permission from elders to speak on this topic. But I never want to decenter the real experiences of two-spirit Indigenous people who are at some of the highest rates of violence, or experience some of the highest rates of violence, and especially experience very high rates of homicide. And so this is an attempt for me to really educate people on what two-spirit means to our communities. But I'm in no way speaking about the issues of any two-spirit individual, and I want to be just really clear about that. So, excuse me. So in general, most Indigenous communities had more than one gender, and the specifics vary from culture to culture. Some tribes have like 40 words for gender differences, 40 different types of pronouns, things like that. Some have fewer, but they're used in very distinct ways and they're used interchangeably. And it really varies, and it's really important if you're working with a two-spirit survivor, you really talk to them about how they would like to be referred to, what they would like to be called, and how they are able to express themselves through their own language and things like that, which we'll talk about in a second. So I want to talk specifically about the term two-spirit. So the two-spirit is a more contemporary term. It came from, it was adapted from the Ojibwe people in probably like the early 90s. And it came out of just a way of especially urban Indigenous folks who were working really hard to reclaim a lot of their identity through series of just relocation and assimilation and these really terrible policies against Indigenous people. And they really wanted a way to identify themselves collectively. And so they came up with the term, where they adopted the term two-spirit. I will say that I really love the term two-spirit, and I use it fairly regularly. I did one time have an elder come up to me and say that for her community, two-spirit was not an appropriate way to describe Indigenous people who are part of the LGBTQIA+ community, because for them, two-spirit held a very different sacred spiritual meaning that had nothing to do with gender identity, sexual orientation, or anything like that. And so again, it's one of those things where we can have the best intentions ever in the whole world, and it might not be appropriate for a certain community. And she was very kind about it, and we talked about what I should describe people from her specific community as, and we were able to have a really educational conversation about it. So it's definitely not something to be scared of. It's definitely a term that's used really widely. But I do think I have a duty to let people know that sometimes it's just not always the appropriate term, and you should always take the lead from the survivor or the individual you're talking about what they'd like to be called. Next slide, please. So gender roles were distinct, and they were likely decided by birth sex. So there were things that I guess Sarah Deer in her book, The Beginning and End of Rape, describes this as a kind of a most statement, like most men did this, most women did this, but it didn't matter if you needed to switch or to change, or sometimes women did specific things while they were menstruating or while they were pregnant, and then they did other what would be considered more masculine things outside of those times. And it just, in these societies, it was about survival and it was about balance. So what worked? What worked for the community? Did it work that were there more masculine people in the community, or were there more feminine people? It just didn't really matter it mattered what created the balance. And so it was just not, it wasn't rigid. There was not an understanding of gender as we see in this kind of dual gender role way that we see in mainstream society. It just wasn't, they just didn't think about it like that, which can be really hard to wrap our minds around because we're so socialized to think about gender roles and your gender role being determined by your birth sex and things like that. But it was just much more fluid than that. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but sexual orientation, sexual preference, and gender identity didn't warrant any moral judgment. So there was we have lots of examples of two-spirit, genderqueer, transgender, Indigenous people who were very, very revered in communities, were very, very well respected, and were considered to be very vital parts of those of their communities and things like that. So as part of that, you can go ahead. That slide was okay. Thank you. As part of that, this difference was celebrated as a spiritual opportunity. So much as kind of we look at the way we learn from children, we saw these individuals as spiritual gifts. So they were, what could we learn from them? What could they teach us? What could they bring to our community? And we thought this about a wide array of things, not just about gender differences or gender presentation, but people who were born with physical or mental disability or things like that. We never considered that it was an accident, but that rather it was an opportunity to learn something from these folks. And we were always very proud of them. There's countless examples of communities that just held them in really high esteem. They held high positions of leadership. They were not ever considered an outsider, but rather were considered a very important part of the community. There are sometimes some instances where if it was very advantageous, actually, if a person could present both as so it's when colonization and first contact happened, it was very advantageous sometimes when someone could present as a woman or as a man for political reasons and for like trade reasons and things like that. It was really kind of advantageous, and we considered them very, very, very important members of our community. And they were also very targeted by violence. They were targeted by the same violence that Indigenous women were targeted with, because very early on, the colonizers were able to identify that this was these people were the core of our community, and by targeting them for violence first, they were able to really break apart those communities much, much quicker. So I want to always make sure that we never look through anything with rose-colored glasses. Violence happened in Indigenous communities. Some Indigenous communities were more violent than others. Some Indigenous communities adopted very, very oppressive and very, very dangerous roles, practices against two-spirit individuals after contact and after colonization. And that's part of our history too. And so Indigenous nations have a lot of work to do to reconcile with that. And the mainstream world has a lot of work to do to reconcile with how we allow violence and oppression to happen towards two-spirit and towards the larger LGBTQIA+ community. So, it's really important when you're working with two-spirit survivors of violence, to understand the ostracization they might feel from their own communities as well. Because some of those, even though they are not historically rooted or not part of our traditional values, just as violence against women and children are not, some of those have been adopted in really dangerous ways. And so we want to be very clear about that, and we want to be very responsive to that they may be in need of finding new community in a way that really fosters the way that they can grow into the whole person that they are. And so we do have extensive evidence from our languages that gender switching, that gender was looked at really, really differently. So I know, like, in our language, in my language, Lashutsi, we have several different prefixes that anyone could use, and they ranged from meaning things like I am a man or I am a woman and I identify as a man or a woman to I have no gender, and even ones that the best way to translate it would be like I have a gender, but my gender is not important to this conversation, so this is the pronoun you're going to use. So, and this is really, many Indigenous communities have these type of pronouns and these types of way of talking about gender when you're talking about yourself. And I think it really indicates just the diverse thought and the diverse ideas that went behind understanding gender in traditional societies. Next slide, please. So what we see in Indigenous communities today is a lot different than what we saw in Indigenous communities of the past. And colonization brought a major shift in Indigenous values. So there were many changes in the policies of the way that the federal government dealt with what was referred to as the Indian problem. So contrary to what I think a lot of people think, is that in very, very early history, especially tribes more out in our neck of the woods and on the West Coast and things like that, they were mostly kind of just ignored. They didn't have, their removal came a lot later, and some of them even had good relationships with the federal government. It wasn't really until westward expansion started and until the colonization continued to move west that these changes in policies became hostile, they became dangerous, and we saw things like the Trail of Tears, the removal of other tribes to reservations, the removal of ceremonies, the removal of communal living arrangements and things like that. So this picture is the only picture that exists of Old Man House, which is was our community house. And that is the house post there. That's the single thing that is left from that house after the house was burnt down. So the house was burnt down. The entire community lived in this house at one time or another. There were kind of there were other villages, so there were other houses as well, but this was the largest one. And they lived in it together. They lived in a communal, in a communal way, in a way that that allowed everyone else to take care of everybody else. And the house was burnt down. And then they were moved into, you can see these tents and these like singular communal structures. And then we also have the influence of boarding schools across Washington, Oregon, and Canada, where children were kidnapped from their homes and kidnapped from their territories and sent to boarding schools. And this was really difficult for communities because they often couldn't speak the language, they were punished for speaking their language. And unfortunately, many of the children thought that their parents had died and that their communities were destroyed. And with no way to communicate with their families, this was in the most terrible way, a really effective way of breaking apart communities. Because a lot of children, after growing up in a boarding school, chose to stay in urban areas based simply on the fact that they had no home. They thought that they had no home to go to. The other thing that was very damaging was that their hair was often cut short, and our hair is very sacred to us. It's there's a lot of tribes have ceremonies around when and how you cut your hair and things like that. And when their hair was cut short, it was a indication that maybe someone had died. So again, that played into this whole idea that their parents were gone and their communities were gone, and what did they have to go back to? So the boarding school era is a tremendously painful time for Indigenous folks. It is also really one of the catalysts that really created some of the more contemporary social problems. And we're going to talk a little bit about historical trauma and the way communities are still grappling with the effects of these traumatic experiences. Next slide, please. So we continue to see shifts in Indigenous values all over as a result of these really traumatic experiences. So as I talked about earlier, we saw violence against Indigenous women, violence against the Two-Spirit community as a way of really just breaking apart communities and making them easier for assimilation, relocation, and removal. We also saw the widespread destruction of the environment. So this happened with the overhunting of the buffalo, which are very sacred, very important to this day of the Lakota and other tribes. And we saw we're seeing it right now, even right now in Nova Scotia with the clash between Indigenous and non-Indigenous fishermen and crabbers and things like that. We also saw a change in socio-political structures. So tribes that were maybe, tribes are kind of forced to identify leaders in a way that was in a way that was different from their traditional view. So they really ended up just having to kind of throw a lot of their traditional views to the wayside as a way of survival. And unfortunately, some of those views were adopted into contemporary culture. And that's one of the reasons why we see the increased rates of traumatic experiences in Indigenous communities. The other thing is that there have just been a ton of systemic and institutional factors and failures. So we have seen the institutions through boarding schools, but also through the what is called the federal trust responsibility. So ultimately, the federal government determined that, yes, we have a responsibility to care for and work with tribal nations in a way that supports them, that gives them the resources and services that they need. And you know, that the creation of treaties and things like that. And unfortunately, many of those treaties remain broken to this day, despite really the federal government in throughout history agreeing that this was the right way to go. You can go to the next slide, please. So I want to start getting into kind of some of the more contemporary issues. And now that we've set a really good foundation of the history and things like that. So it's really difficult to quantify the scope of violence against Indigenous women. One, because we all know that intimate partner crimes, sexual assault, those kinds of crimes are very, very underreported in mainstream culture, and even more so for Indigenous communities. The best estimates that we have is that they are assaulted at about 2.5 to 3.5 times the national average. There are many people that I work with in the field who believe that it's much higher than that. And, you know, we always anecdotally say that I live in an Indigenous community and I do not know one Indigenous woman, one Indigenous Two-Spirit person, or anywhere in between that has not been the victim of intimate partner violence in some way, or a victim of assault, or a victim of stranger assault or sexual assault. So we think that these rates are much higher, and there's a lot of reasons why they are not reported at the rate that they probably should be. And that goes into a lot of distrust about the federal government, a lot of distrust of police, and things like that. When you're coming from a community where they really have little reason to put their faith in institutions, it is difficult to get Indigenous survivors to kind of get to a point to where they can report crimes. And that's a really important part of working with survivors, and making sure that when you respond to them, you're never responding in a way that makes them think that they need to report, or that they will even have a better outcome if they report, because that's not necessarily the reality for Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people who are experiencing violence. The other part to this is that homicide rates are much higher than national average. On some reservations, they're 10 times higher than national average, and in some cases, an Indigenous woman is more likely to be murdered or to be abused or to be raped than she is to graduate from college. And so it's a really terrible reality to have to live with. And it also really impacts the way that Indigenous women live their lives when they know that they're kind of waiting for this to happen. And I think also it's important to remember that the experiences of violence are not just confined to their relationship or to the assault, but Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people and also Indigenous men, when they're working with institutions, experience violence on every level of that institution. So we experience violence through the criminal justice system. We experience higher rates of violence at the hands of police. We experience higher incarceration rates and higher rates of violence once we are incarcerated, as well as experiencing higher rates of violence within interpersonal relationships. So it's just really important to remember that these experiences are part of the whole story. And what we haven't experienced on our own, we may have experienced through our parents or our grandparents and lived through those and have experienced it through those stories. We go to the next slide, please. So I do want to talk a little bit, I won't spend too much time on MMIW, but I think this is something that is really, really popular right now. I guess popular is probably a bad term, but it's getting a lot of political momentum right now with some of the exciting legislative things that have happened and the passing of the Not Invisible Act and the Savannahs Act. And there's really a lot of momentum behind this. So again, and this is also, I'm a graduate student at Seattle University, and this is what my thesis research is on. So I always like to talk about it a little bit and make sure we're keeping that in part of the conversation. So we, especially for missing Indigenous women, it's a little bit easier to quantify when they have been the victims of homicide, but missing Indigenous women, rates are largely unknown. It's really, really hard to keep track of missing people in general. There are a lot of factors that go into why we just kind of don't know how many Indigenous women are missing. So our best evidence, or our best estimate, is that we have about 6,000-ish, somewhere in there. Most statisticians and researchers think that that is a grossly underestimated number, and that is for a couple of reasons. So the first reason is that there's not a great data collection tool, and we see this across all jurisdictions and all communities, where the law enforcement is responsible for reporting who's missing and reporting into data collection systems like the Unified Crime Report or NamUs. I guess NamUs now individuals can report to that, but there are other, the NCIC and these other criminal justice-based data collection tools. And not all police are required, and not all police have access to those databases. So there's really no widespread data collection that everybody participates in. And then sometimes that data isn't retained appropriately. So sometimes it's individual police departments are collecting that data, and if we have somebody who's went missing 25 years ago and they're not in any database, and we go to the police station, they may not even have those records anymore for a variety of reasons. The second reason this is really difficult is racial misclassification. So I talk a lot about this. This is one of my kind of niches that I really think is fascinating. And so for part of my thesis research, what I've done is gone through Washington state death certificates and looked at Indigenous homicide victims because I'm then looking at them in a media context. But first I needed to go and kind of dig through all this data. And I found out a lot about how we classify those who have passed away and how we collect racially identifying information. And so it's very different from each jurisdiction. And sometimes you are collecting it in sometimes one person is responsible for collecting it, like the police or the person who finds the victim of homicide, or sometimes the medical examiner is responsible for racial identification. And the other thing is that Indigenous people are very diverse. We don't all look the same. We don't all have the same hair color, the same skin color. There isn't a mark on us that says, hey, we're Indigenous. And then also sometimes Indigenous people are enrolled in a tribe, and sometimes they're just a member of a community. Sometimes they are Indigenous, but they don't live on a reservation. And so there's all these competing factors that make racial misclassification really, really common. And so we think this is one of the reasons why the numbers are so unreported, especially for historical data. So on the census, what a lot of people don't know is they actually used to use the word N to count both Native and Black folks, although they didn't use the word Black. But I'm not going to use the word that they used, but they used the word, they used the letter N to be able to identify both of them. So it's almost impossible now, 50 years later, to be able to identify who was Native and who was Black or African American. There's also, we're going to talk about these two issues in a little bit more detail, so I'll just briefly mention them here. But there's also cultures of impunity. So the way that our interjurisdictional relationships work, sometimes it's very hard to prosecute offenders. And then also, more to the interjurisdictional relationship part, sometimes it's very difficult to actually be able to know which jurisdiction takes the report, or which jurisdiction is responsible for the missing person investigation and things like that. And on a lot of tribal police departments, they don't actually have access to the databases and things like that allow for sharing of information between departments. So in some cases, women might be Indigenous women, men, girls, etc., might be reported missing to their tribal police department, and that missing person report just doesn't go anywhere because they have actually no relationship with their other jurisdictions to share it. We go to the next slide, please. And so the other thing I always make a point to talk about when we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women, we also need to talk about sex trafficking, because those are very, very closely linked together. We don't have great data on this. It's kind of my, I kind of am just on repeat. There just isn't any great data. But we do know from some Canadian studies that Indigenous women in Canada are trafficked at much higher rates. We do have the Garden of Truth report, which is a report that's about 10 years old now, but it comes out of Minnesota, and we know that Indigenous women are experiencing sex trafficking, and that it's closely tied to their experiences of violence and also the historical context of violence. So a lot of people describe sex trafficking as the new form of Indigenous relocation. So just as we were trafficked in the name of westward expansion, in the name of capitalism, however you want to frame it, we were also now Indigenous women and girls and men are being trafficked in the name of the commodification of bodies. And that's really kind of an interesting way to frame it, and it kind of takes into consideration the totality of experiences. Again, we are going to talk about jurisdiction in a second, so I'm just going to skip that. The other thing that's really important when we're talking about sex trafficking in Indigenous communities is the impact of seasonal and temporary work sites. So Indigenous communities are often very rural, very remote, or if they're urban, they're located near major highways or things like that, like the I-405 or the I-5 corridor, those kinds of things. And because of that, it really creates a perfect environment for trafficking, especially in, I would say, especially in rural areas where there may be lower economic opportunity or higher rates of violence in general. So we also know that these seasonal and temporary work sites create violence, increase violence kind of across the board. So they increase regular assault, sexual assault, sex trafficking, all of those kinds of things. And when we talk about the intersection of violence against Indigenous communities and environmental issues, a lot of this comes into play when we're talking about things like the pipeline or any type of environmental work that's being done that requires these temporary work sites. One of the major issues and one of the major reasons why Indigenous people do not approve of those things on their land is not just the destruction of the environment, but also the destruction of the community and the violence that is perpetuated against its members. Next slide, please. So there are very distinct barriers to addressing violence against Indigenous women and in Indigenous communities. I think that one of those that we've kind of talked about throughout the presentation is geographic and social isolation. So people feel very isolated. They feel isolated socially. They feel isolated. They live far away and they can't get to services. They can't get out of their situation. They can't get to more economic opportunities. And some reservations across the nation are vast. If you think about like the Navajo Nation spreads over several states. And so we're looking at, they may need to drive 2 or 3 hours just to get to the nearest post office or the nearest grocery store or something like that. So it's not just about getting services to address victimization, but it's also about getting services that are able to provide for a higher quality of life and really empower them to take on and to take on some of their life circumstances, their more dangerous life circumstances. So the other thing, these two things kind of go hand in hand, is both relationship with service providers and relationship with government agencies. One of the things we didn't talk about is that Indigenous, or we did talk about it a little bit, but Indigenous people have also been victimized by agencies and by government institutions that are designed to protect them. So some of them, if we think about like some of the things that are still going on today is like the forced sterilization or the unnotified sterilization of Indigenous women. And so, they are afraid to go to doctors. They're afraid to do those kinds of things because of these long-term historical experiences. As we talked about the example of the Navajo Nation, sometimes there's very low employment rates and very lack of financial opportunity, and they're really trying to gauge whether or not leaving for economic reasons is worth leaving where they may have their only support system, where their families live, where their traditional ceremonies take place, and those kinds of things. And they have to weigh those traditional and contemporary values of, do I go out into this big world where I might have more opportunity, but I'm going to lose my support system, or do I stay here? And we see the same kind of reconciliation going on when we're dealing with victimization. So if they're victimized within their community, do they leave their community and leave, even though their abuser might be there, their support is also there. So do they leave? Do they stay? And those kinds of things. And so this is where I think urban Indigenous communities have been so helpful in really mitigating these issues and really helping people who've had to leave because of unhealthy life circumstances and be able to really create a new home that honors their Indigenous identity, that honors their history and things, and creates new community and new kinship ties. Next slide, please. So I just continue to talk about some of the ways of addressing violence, how we can address violence against Indigenous women, violence against Indigenous people, and against Indigenous Two-Spirit communities. So we need to really increase sanctions on violence against women and violence against those communities. But we also need to think about what does a sanction mean? What does it mean? Because sometimes it's not appropriate to incarcerate someone. Sometimes that's not the traditional method of dealing with it. Sometimes Indigenous people have their own robust, balance restoring ways of being able to address violence in their community and bring their community whole again. And so that can be another obstacle to reporting, is if an Indigenous person who's experienced violence feels like the action of the state or the action of the criminal justice system might make the problem worse, they'll be less likely to report. And so we really need to broaden our ideas of what justice means for Indigenous communities, because it doesn't mean the same thing as kind of the mainstream community. And I think that we're feeling that in all kinds of BIPOC groups. And it's really a great time to have this conversation because of the national attention that all of this is having, is that these communities just don't necessarily align with the way that we have determined as a mainstream community what criminal justice should look like. And we need to expand that view and legitimize tribal government systems, tribal criminal justice systems, and tribal Indigenous traditional ways of practicing justice in a way that empowers the tribal government to really understand all of the competing parts. And then, yeah, we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the jurisdictional gap. And I just wanted to, this is probably too complicated to get into the time we have left, but I do really encourage people to look at what the jurisdictional gap means, because what this jurisdictional gap has created is that there are just really wide areas of like where there's no jurisdiction for non-Indigenous people who commit crime on Indigenous lands. And so this is really complicated, and I think we'll get, I'll leave everybody to kind of look at this, and then feel free to get back to me with any questions you have about this, because it's a really important part to seeking justice. We can do the next slide, please. And this is just an image of what jurisdiction looks like in Indian country. Next slide, please. So to end, I just want to talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma. So this is just, I think, a good way of visualizing how trauma happens and how it's passed on to generation. And so, but I want to go to the next slide, please. So I think that it's really important when we are dealing with Indigenous survivors that we always make sure that we look at the individual responses to historical trauma. Survivors, whether they have lived in Indigenous communities or they've been displaced from Indigenous communities, are going to experience trauma as a whole community. And it can really impact the way that they feel, that how they respond to advocacy, to mental health treatment, to all of those kinds of things. They can feel numb, they can feel angry or denial, they can be preoccupied with the past and with honoring ancestors in a way that creates friction from to moving on and moving on in their trauma through their trauma and into healing. They may feel guilty about surviving things, all of those kinds of things. So we want to make sure that we are attuned to that. Next slide, please. There's also family levels. So I just want to touch on the traditional and appropriate parenting roles, because this is one of the main ways intergenerational trauma is transferred, is that parents were were deprived of traditional methods and they were replaced with negative models. So they were in boarding schools, or they were the parents of children, or the children of parents who were traumatized in boarding schools, and they learned negative models of parenting through no fault of their own. And this led to messages of that Indigenous families are not adequate, that they deserve to be intervened by the criminal justice system or the child welfare system, and that ultimately led to higher levels of family violence, abuse, and neglect. Next slide, please. And then the community can also respond to intergenerational trauma, and they may have trouble planning or looking to the future. They may have higher rates of crime and other social problems, higher rates of interpersonal violence, and those kinds of things. And it's important to even when you're working with a member of an Indigenous community, that you understand the competing. They may want to move forward, but their community may, through formal and informal ways, still be responding to intergenerational trauma. And next slide, please. Let's get through these last ones. So I think, just to close, I think that there are a couple of things we can do to really meaningfully move forward from all of this. We need to advocate for meaningful collaboration between tribes and tribal programs. We need to advocate for Indigenous-led, community-driven research that really tells the whole story of what it means to live and experience violence in an Indigenous community. We need to adopt best practices in all of our programs that are grounded in Indigenous values, because we at WomenSpirit Coalition really believe that Indigenous values are the key to unlocking healing from trauma in a wide sense of the word. And then we need to make sure we're enacting policies and procedures on state, federal, and local levels that reflect the experiences of Indigenous women and their communities, and honor that the violence, the colonization, and the removal, and all of those things we spent the last little bit talking about as a way of really moving forward from that. I think there's just a couple more slides. Next slide, please. Oh, we can skip this one. This is in the wrong spot, sorry. So here at WomenSpirit Coalition, we're doing all of these things, working on collecting data, providing technical assistance, getting to come to wonderful presentations like this and talk to and meet wonderful people who share the same values and missions that we do, and really educate and empower communities to assist with their indigenous relatives in a way that fosters resiliency, that fosters healing, and that promotes a really high quality education. I think there's just one more slide. And so this is just more things that we do at our respective projects. Next slide, please. And these are some things that you can do as an individual to just recognize all of the things that we talked about today, be more educated about them, and all of that stuff. Next slide, please. And we can just go. People can read this and talk about this. And then I think on an institutional level, we talked about this too. This is just kind of more detail, so people can read this, read through this at their leisure. And I just want to end by saying thank you again for inviting me and letting me be part of this. It was a great experience, and I'm glad that we got to gather. And, you know, I just always include this picture of Suquamish. These are the shores of my homeland. The blood and the sweat of my ancestors lives in that water and in that sand. And I think it's easy, even for us Indigenous folks, to think of that, you know, things are hard and we experience lots of violence and lots of inequity. But we also came to, you know, this was the year that Suquamish hosted the Tribal Canoe Journey. And, you know, we were able to gather as entire nations, as people, to celebrate our culture and our lands and our relationships. And it's important to celebrate those things too, and to be part of those things too, because it's this version of community, it's this version of togetherness that creates our wonderful, resilient spirits that keep us moving through the really hard days. So thank you. I think the last slide is just my contact info. Yeah, so here's my contact info of how to get a hold of me. I'd love to talk to anybody who wants to talk more about what we talked about today. Sorry, I had to rush there to get through the last few slides. I sometimes get carried away. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everything today.
Thank you so much, Annie. We will follow up with any questions we receive in writing and send them out to the group on a larger perspective. One question that I know will come up and has come up for us in the past is your comments around two-spirit cultures and two-spirit identities, and I spent some time in culturally responsive programming with Bradley Engel here locally before working at OHSU. So folks often will ask me how we worked with two-spirit in culture or two-spirit individuals and spoke to them about that identity at a culturally responsive community-based agency, which is a little different than a medical setting. And right. So if there's anything that you have to add to how a provider could feel best prepared around working with folks when they do want to open up about that identity, especially in terms of our trans health providers, which are so passionate here at OHSU about the work they do. So anything you wanted to add on that? And yeah, I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that, kind of my go-to solution is I think it's really important to let those relationships really develop organically. And I think that can be constricting sometimes when you're looking at when you have things you have to meet, or you have grants you have to report to, or things like that, and you need the information right away. And I think my best piece of advice is, what we say here at the Resource Center when we're doing intakes is that we allow those intakes, we allow that process to take as long as it needs to. It's an ongoing process. So we might do a questionnaire that captures what we need for our grant reporting, and then we allow that intake to just be an ongoing organic process. And we always let them know if something you said on that demographic page isn't right, if you said it because that's how you felt at the moment and now you feel differently, that can be edited. That is not, that piece of paper doesn't define you. The other thing that's been really helpful for us is that I actually really recommend that my staff not take paperwork and things like that into intakes with them. So I really emphasize that we spend time getting to know the client and getting to know the survivor on a personal level, on a one-on-one level. We can always go back and take notes and fill in documents and call with follow-up questions and things like that. But what's most important is that you identify that whatever you say here, it's safe. You're safe here. It's not going to leave here. It's not going to define you. You can change your answer whenever you want. And that's not, you'll just go, as a provider, I'm just going to go with the flow on that. And I think that's really all we can do. It's hard sometimes because we can only do, as providers, we can only do so much. And that is to make the client feel as empowered as they can to identify how they feel best. So.
Thank you so much. That was a perfect answer because that will apply in so many different contexts.
Awesome.
I appreciate all of your time. Thank you so much. And thank you to the EdCom team, our ASL interpreters, Stacy and the rest of the CAP team, and Stephanie, wherever they might be, and the work they're doing as well. Thank you, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too.